This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, I'm Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
But the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all you need to know about me. The podcast though, we're here to talk about films and more specifically to talk about the stories behind films. In this podcast I tend to examine marketing stories, development stories, behind the scenes stories, just those tales that help go to make the films we know and usually sometimes love. Just that, the films that we usually stroke sometimes love. I do really like the two films I'm talking about in this episode. The movies I tend to zero in on for the podcast have a mainstream leaning on the whole. They're also films that I've got some degree of investment or interest in. I'm not very good at snark, I'm afraid. And so, with all that in mind, I'm going to kick off. I'm going to kick off with a relatively recent blockbuster movie. I'm going to take you back to 2014. Here's a little snippet of a trailer. I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
What day is it?
Judgment Day. You just came in with the fresh recruits.
This is not the end.
The invasion will fail, along with every soldier you are sending. We lose
This is not
everything.
the end.
Come find me when you wake up.
That then is a clip from 2014's Edge of Tomorrow. That was sort of the title they eventually decided on, as I'm going to come to shortly. Directed this one by Doug Liman, starring Tom Cruise, Emily Blunt, Bill Paxton and Brendan Gleeson. The writing credits were split between Jez Butterworth, John Henry Butterworth and Christopher McQuarrie. But the origins of this one, well, they're about 5 years before we actually got to see the film. So sometimes on the Film Stories podcast, I talk about films that have taken an awful lot of time in development. This one, start to finish, for what it was half a decade, which really wasn't bad, really, when you consider the complexity and how effects-driven large parts of the movie were. So let's go back to 2009, and that's when the publisher Viz Media first released the novel All You Need Is Kill by Hiroshi Sakurazaka. And this was around the point, you might remember, where Hollywood studios were circling around Japanese properties. I remember a lot at the time there was talk of a live-action Akira remake. That's still bubbling around now. There was talk for a long time of a live-action take on Ghost in the Shell, which did finally happen, of course. But in the midst of all of this, All You Need Is Kill was the kind of property that Hollywood studios were sniffing around. Now, the plan was really to move quite quickly in terms of getting a film made, and to get studio interest fast as well. And so Viz Media decided to take the initiative here, really. They wanted to be the catalyst. And so before it approached studios, it was working in conjunction with a company called 3 Arts Entertainment that had picked up an option on All You Need Is Kill. And rather than sell the rights to the book to a Hollywood studio, what they did was they put a screenplay together themselves. And this is and was rare. They hired Dante Harper, and Harper took away the novel, read it, and just thought, there's no way I can turn this into a film. And his initial reaction was just to kind of balk at it a little bit, concerned in particular by just how dense the novel was. But he was intrigued, he was interested, he wanted to give it a go, and he duly did. As a consequence, he would spend the best part of a year putting together what became the first draft of the screenplay, really, that was seen by Hollywood studios. And so by early 2010, that script was ready to be put out for auction. Now, in effect, this was going out as a spec script, and so this was rare at this point. Now, in the 1990s, the spec script market absolutely ballooned. So, if you don't know, this is when a script is, well, it's just written on spec. So it's not paid for by a studio or anything like that. There's no studio money behind it. And so what we saw is what writers like Shane Black and Joe Esterhaus did this quite a lot in the 1990s. They go away and write a script and then sell it. And obviously the risk there is you don't make a penny for it because no studio is interested. But if you can entice a studio to a spec script, you tended to be able to get a higher price. And so the market ballooned for a while. I think the price topped out about $4 million, I think it was, for Joe Esterhaus's Jade, which was ultimately made by William Friedkin at Paramount. But the spec script market really had petered out by 2010, which is where we were. And so for this spec script to go out to market based on a pre-existing property, based in an area that Hollywood was interested in exploring, well, it struck gold, and studios were interested, and it was Warner Brothers that quickly bit. And it stumped up nearly $3 million for the script and the rights for the project. And also, it wasn't just that, though, because a Deadline report at the point where that deal was inked goes into a little bit more detail. And just to give you an idea of the cards that Viz Media and 3 Arts Entertainment were holding here, they'd written into the deal a quite aggressive pact in terms of getting the film before cameras inside a year. They didn't just want Hollywood's money. They wanted this to be turned into a movie. And so again, put into the context of spec scripts really were on the rare side. This was a headline-grabbing deal, not just for the amount of money concerned, but also that clause, the very fact that this film was going to be made fast. But Warner Brothers liked that. This was Warner as it's coming to the end of its Harry Potter cycle. It was on the search for big blockbuster films to fill its slate. It was after new, interesting projects that in 2010, when this auction was kicking off, it wasn't quite the superhero-dominated landscape that I guess we're more familiar with today. And there was a feeling that there was a space for a project like this. Warner Brothers liked the idea that it could turn this film round quickly. And so it set to work. It bought the project, it stumped up its cash, and so it went looking for a director. And it made a deal in August of 2010. So this is still moving quickly with Doug Liman. Now, we've talked Doug Liman before on the Film Stories podcast when we looked at the story of the making of The Bourne Identity. And after The Bourne Identity, he was told by the head of Universal Studios at that point, because of the erratic way that he'd made the film, that he would never work in Hollywood again. Of course, The Bourne Identity went on to be a massive hit. He would go on and do Mr. and Mrs. Smith. But Lyman's style is very counter to the way that Hollywood studios like things to be. That he's a bit more freeform. He's a bit more guerrilla, really, in the way that he approaches stuff. And when it works, it works. And when it doesn't, I mean, he's heavily in post-production on Chaos Walking at the moment, based on the Patrick Ness book, going through all sorts of reshoots and redevelopment. I mean, that is a little bit de rigueur for a Doug Liman project. And yet the end result is generally really quite interesting. So at that point, just to contextualise it in history a bit, Lyman had just wrapped up on the film Fair Game with Naomi Watts, and he was actually committed to doing, at that point, a Three Musketeers film for Warner Brothers. That they'd been circling that project, and that stalled when a rival Three Musketeers project, I believe would be the Paul W.S. Anderson one, went into production first, and so Warner Brothers backed away. At this point, All You Need Is Kill was its film title had changed to We Are Mortals, and it wouldn't be the last title that the project went through even after its release. So with Fair Game in the can, Lyman signed on the dotted line in the summer of 2010, and the screenplay from Dante Harper would actually appear on the Blacklist, which is, again, if you're unfamiliar with it, every year a list is produced of the best unproduced screenplays in Hollywood, and the script for Edge of Tomorrow, as it would ultimately become known, was on that list. So this was really a project that had real thrust and momentum behind it, and a degree of interest in it. That said, There were issues over that script. Lyman in particular had problems with the third act of the film, and there was a report in Vulture around the time that said of the script, quote, "The protagonist dispatches aliens in the same rote way a 12-year-old who's played too much Xbox 360." And there was a feeling that the ending really didn't quite measure up to the film beforehand. So writing work continued, therefore, and if we go forward at this point to June of 2011, the rewrites and the development of the script was ongoing at this point, and Joby Harold had been hired to come in and do a polish, while Doug Liman at this stage had picked up another film to make. He was due to make a movie called Luna, a science fiction film for Paramount Pictures, and so while he was off doing that, I presume some degree of renegotiation of the deal took place that allowed Warner Brothers a little more time to get this film made. So the idea was Lyman could go away and do that, and script work would continue on Edge of Tomorrow, to the point where casting was underway as well on the movie, and the name in the frame for Edge of Tomorrow at first in the lead role was Brad Pitt. And in the midst of all of this, Luna, the sci-fi movie Lyman was doing at Paramount, well, that project stalled, and you don't need me to tell you that's never come to light since. And so by the autumn of 2011, Lyman was back, fully focused on what was I'd then gone back to. I think I did try and track the chronology when the titles changed. I think at this point it was back known to All You Need Is Kill. Pitt had a couple of offers in from Warner Brothers, though, because there was also a film called The Mission that David O. Russell was set to make. And so Warner Brothers was hedging its bets, really. It wanted a Brad Pitt movie. It offered Pitt a couple of projects. As it turned out, he would make neither. And he did, in fact, turn down All You Need Is Kill. Warner Brothers, nonetheless, wanted a star. He just wanted some insurance on this project, and so in October 2011 the offer of the lead role went out to Tom Cruise. Now, Tom Cruise was incredibly busy at this point and was going through a career resurgence after Mission Impossible 3's box office had fallen in the mid-2000s, had fallen below expectations. That was blamed on Cruise, and that was blamed on matters of his personal life. But then the fourth Mission Impossible film was a record breaker for the franchise, and all of a sudden everybody wanted Tom Cruise again, Warner Brothers included. It wasn't the only science fiction film that Tom Cruise was being offered at the time, because he also signed up to make Oblivion, which he would also ultimately do just beforehand with Universal. He was also on the Warner Brothers payroll already for committing to a supporting role in the big screen take on the musical Rock of Ages, and his star power was back pumped up, basically, and he said yes to what would become Edge of Tomorrow. Filming then was set to begin in the autumn of 2012, so it's still moving with some degree of pace, but Lyman still at this point wasn't happy with the script. Now, changes had been made to accommodate the fact that Tom Cruise had been cast in the movie because he's older than the character in the film, older than the character in the novel who would ultimately portray it in the film. So rewrite work had gone on. In April 2012, Emily Blunt had signed on the dotted line as well, and also in 2002, and Emily Blunt, I have to say, is outstanding in this film, really, really terrific. I can't just get through her with one line because I just think her input to the film is really immense. Also in 2012, more names were added to the rewrite roster. Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci, who had been working on the Star Trek films, they came in and did a rewrite of the screenplay. I think that happened around the start of 2012. But by the time we were at Easter, with Emily Blunt just signing on the dotted line, Tom Cruise was on board and filming, just months away, Lyman threw out 60 to 70% of Dante Harper's screenplay with a view to rebuild the movie pretty much from scratch. This is what he told the Los Angeles Times around the time. He wanted to rebuild the movie from scratch. At that point then, in came the screenwriters Jez Butterworth and John Henry Butterworth to do rewrite work, but they too struggled really to come up with a final act that satisfied what Doug Liman was after. At that point then, in came more writers. The baton at that point passed to Simon Kinberg. Now, Simon Kinberg, of course, has most recently directed X-Men Dark Phoenix, and a very accomplished screenwriter. He took a pass at it, but with 8 weeks to go before production was due to start, they really were getting incredibly close to the starting line. In came regular Tom Cruise collaborator Christopher McQuarrie, who'd just been directing Cruise in the first Jack Reacher film, but he's been involved, he's directed the last couple of Mission Impossible films, and he'll be directing the next couple of Mission Impossible films. He's been involved in about 10, 11 Tom Cruise movies now at this point. He came in to do work on the screenplay. As it turned out, he would do a lot of work on the screenplay. The tensions inevitably were really rather high because the stakes were hardly low on this one. Warner Brothers was pumping a lot of money into this film. That the ultimate production budget for the movie would come in at $180 million, and it was up against some big films with real franchise power behind them. Even though the box office at X-Men Days of Future Past, for instance, would go on to be far higher than was actually expected, that was still an X-Men film. There was a Transformers sequel in there. There was a Captain America sequel in there. Guardians of the Galaxy was regarded as a risk, of course, although we all saw how that turned out in the end. But there are a lot of films queuing up that just seem to have more inbuilt franchise appeal, and thus this was a very expensive movie with Tom Cruise. His name above the headline, but how much really would that break through at the summer box office, which was when Warner Brothers was targeting this movie. And so that combined with Lyman's style led to some quite snappy, from what I can work out, pre-production meetings, and Lyman would say, I was a little under pressure and I snapped. And apparently Emily Blunt said to him, easy, I've never made a movie like this before. And Lyman said back to her, well, neither have I. And as Lyman noticed, like the room sort of ground to a halt. And Lyman's producer on the film, one of them, Erwin Stahl, would say he'd never heard a director saying weeks before the start of a film that he all but had no idea what he was doing. But that really played to Tom Cruise, because Tom Cruise just loved the honesty of Doug Liman. They've gone on to make another film since, The Underrated American Maid, and Emily Blunt would also praise Lyman's lack of filter. I think most people think, he's just an incredible interviewee. He just is about the least filtered interviewee you can get. A really interesting man who makes really interesting films. Production on this one finally began on October the 1st, 2012. And to give you an idea of Lyman's style, they completed the first day of shooting. And on October the 2nd, 2012, Lyman came in and said he wanted to redo everything they'd done on the first day of shooting. Now, production was mainly based at Leavesden Studios, just north of London, here in the UK. There was some location work, but also it was all being done in the autumn and winter in Britain. So, good luck with that. As such, you got rain and you got rubbish weather. You didn't get an awful lot of light. There was a big beach set built at the time, and Lyman was really trying to capture the flavour of World War II set movies for the production. That, even though Edge of Tomorrow is a film set in the future, it is a war. It is the reporting of a war. It is I don't want to give too much of the film away for those who haven't seen it, but the whole idea of this Groundhog Day mechanic mixed with a futuristic war movie really plays out quite wonderfully throughout the movie. But to give you an idea of the scale and ambition of the shooting, they shot off Trafalgar Square in London on a Saturday for shooting, and a huge logistical effort to do that. I know that's relatively commonplace in some American cities, that big areas of the city are just cordoned off for filming. An area like Trafalgar Square, that's very, very rare, especially on a Saturday. Lyman worked around the clock, as he generally always does on the film, and he was doing 7 days a week, and he would also employ the kind of guerrilla style that he'd used on some of his other films. He notably, as I've talked in the previous podcast again, snatched some of the footage for The Bourne Identity just without permission, just one morning when he needed a couple of extra shots, without telling Universal. He just went and got them in the can. In this one, there's the introductory sequences in the film that were actually shot in his edit suite, just him and Tom Cruise, just sort of did them on the fly, really. Filming ultimately wrapped on the movie, though, in August 2013. So this one shot for, about 9 months, a very sizable period of physical production. Around the same time, in the summer of 2013, it was announced actually that Jeremy Piven had been added to the film for its reshoots, although whilst his sequences were shot, they were never ultimately included in the film. Now, it was an intense production, and a release date of summer 2014 was finally confirmed, and this was around the point where the title changed, and the title became Edge of Tomorrow, and it sounds like one of those utter compromise titles that no one particularly liked, but no one could come up with anything massively better. And Doug Liman certainly has never been a fan of the title Edge of Tomorrow. The reason he was given for the change was that studio testing had revealed that All You Need Is Kill wasn't a title that was going down particularly well for a summer blockbuster. Having the word kill in it didn't particularly work. Liman was pushing heavily for the film to be called Live, Die, Repeat. He accepted and knew that the title had to change. He lost the battle to get the title that he wanted. Now, the movie, in the end, I mean, there was still stuff going on pretty much late in the day. I mean, composer Christoph Beck was a late addition to the film. He took over from Ramin Djawadi, who in himself had taken over from Doug Liman's first choice, who was John Powell, because John Powell was just taking a break at that point. And the film came out in the end in America against Maleficent and The Fault in Our Stars, which turned out to be two huge hits in the States. And if you go purely down the box office of the US box office of 2014, Edge of Tomorrow is actually in 33rd place. I mean, it's quite low down the list. Came out in June 2014. It had a good opening weekend, an opening weekend of $28 million. It would go on to just scrape over $100 million in the US, and it was his overseas. I mean, Tom Cruise's star power is better overseas than in America these days, but it was its overseas take that finally brought the box office up to around 370 million all in. When it came to the home release, though, I mean, this is equally as notable a story, really. Warner Brothers had another go at marketing the movie because it's a bit of a concept and a half to try and get across. And the poster that it put out in the end said Tom Cruise, Emily Blunt, Edge of Tomorrow, with the tagline Live, Die, Repeat. When it came to the DVD release, the name Edge of Tomorrow was relegated. The film was still effectively called that, but the words that were beefed up on the cover, and most of us and would have left just a bystander with the impression this is what the film was called, were Live, Die, Repeat, with a view of giving it a push on home formats. And it did do better on home formats, and the film has certainly built its audience, that it was reviewed well. I think it's a really, really good movie. It's really worth checking out if you've not already, but it was reviewed really well, and the box office didn't particularly marry up with that, but the word of mouth has kept it going to the point where there remains talk of a sequel, and Christopher McQuarrie talks about doing a sequel. It's Tom Cruise apparently had the idea for it. Cruise would be back for it. Doug Liman would be back for it. Liman wants the sequel to be called Live, Die, Repeat, Repeat. He's, they're not underselling it either. I mean, Liman said that the plan is to revolutionise sequels. We're also told if it happens, it will be a 2-film franchise. It is, at the time of this podcast being recorded, in Tom Cruise's queue of projects that he's got. He's just finishing up Top Gun Maverick, then he's got 2 Mission Impossible films to make back to back. It's quite feasible that Edge of Tomorrow 2 or Live, Die, Repeat will just keep falling back the queue. It might happen. Stranger things have happened, certainly. I sort of hope it does as well. I think Edge of Tomorrow is one of the best mainstream blockbuster science fiction films of the last 5 years, and even though its marketing was mishandled, and even though they still struggle really to get across what the film is, I just think it's well worth digging out, and the fact that it came start to finish in a 5-year period in spite of all the chaos in the midst of all of that is some achievement. We're at the halfway point. Crikey, better do all the plugs, better go quickly, because I seem to be talking quite a lot on this podcast, more than usual. I mean, so the new issue of Film Stories magazine with Jason Isaacs on the front cover, that's on sale now. I've also got issue 1 of Film Stories Junior magazine. These are 2 print magazines we make here in the UK. Mainstream, giving loads of people opportunity, filmmakers and writers opportunity. We're really proud of them. If you'd like to buy a copy, they're at www.filmstories.co.uk. blockbuster.co.uk is the best place. Mail order is the best way to get them. They are in a few selected WH Smith shops around the UK. If you like this podcast, please do subscribe to it. Please do leave ideally a hugely positive review. 2 more quick things, then I'll get on to the second film. I've got a new book out. It's called The Secret Life of Movies. It's published by Octopus. It's on sale now. If you get inclined to support that, that would be wonderful as well. And then I'm taking Film Stories out on tour, bringing the magazine and the book around sites around the UK. I'm in all sorts of independent cinemas, starting on the 7th of September 2019 in Halifax. You can find all of the live dates for Film Stories at that website, filmstories.co.uk. Just click on the live dates tab at the top of the screen. Right, best crack on with the second film. I'm going to go much further back this one. I'm going back to the early 90s. I'm going back to a hit comedy. I'm going back to a hit Oscar-winning comedy. Here's a clip from it, which you can find that I've cunningly edited the swear word out.
Lighten up, okay? Don't worry, I'm going to help you.
Gee, thanks.
Excuse me, but I think a modicum of gratitude would not be out of line here.
You think I should be grateful?
Yeah, I mean, it's your ass, not mine. I think you should be grateful. I think you should be down on your knees.
Your knees. How about that for editing, chums? I tell you, there's a job in Hollywood waiting for me somewhere. That is a clip from 1992's hit comedy My Cousin Vinny, written by Dale Lorna, directed by Jonathan Lynn. This one starred Joe Pesci, Marissa Tomei, Ralph Macchio and Fred Gwynne in there as well. And the origins of this one actually go back a couple of decades before we finally saw the film. And they lie with writer Dale Lorna. Now, Lorna's had all sorts of hits in Hollywood, actually. He was credited with the scripts of Ruthless People, Blind Date, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, although he says of Blind Date that it was rewritten an awful lot and isn't particularly his. But he's got quite a lot of credits and has given quite a lot of interesting interviews about his work. He said, and he talked to a website called Abnormal Use for about his work on My Cousin Vinny and where it came from, and I pulled in some of his quotes from that interview. I really do recommend digging it out. But he said that the origins of the film for him were in the early 1970s, where he got talking to someone who'd taken the bar exam. So My Cousin Vinny is a legal comedy about Joe Pesci plays Vinny, who's a not particularly good lawyer who has to represent 2 people in a murder case of which they're innocent of the murder. I don't think we can call that a massive spoiler, really. And so the inspiration came from this guy who's just said, well, you can fail the bar exam time and time again and still qualify as a lawyer. I think that rule has changed since, or certainly Lorna said that in one of his interviews. But basically the whole idea of learning you had a lawyer who'd failed the exam umpteen times had potential in his head. I mean, he saw the comedy, because then he threw in the idea of a small town and, just a couple of innocent parties who then find themselves with on paper the lawyer they least want. He decided to set it in the deep south of America, and this was around the era, around the time, the aftermath of Easy Rider coming out, and there were quite potent stereotypes, really, of what the deep south of America was, and so he kind of parked that idea in his head, and when he'd had a few successes, he took a trip. He took a trip to the deep south of America. He went through the likes of Alabama, and he talked to people involved in the law there, and so he basically pulled this cocktail of information and ideas that he'd had over the years together, and he started to form what would become My Cousin Vinny. One of the things I should note from the start, for a variety of reasons, is My Cousin Vinny is a courtroom comedy where the courtroom behaviour and the legal process is heavily praised for just how accurate it is, and that started that lies both with Jonathan Lynn, as I'm going to come to, but also with Dale Lorna and the research that he did. That he said he went and had conversations with a legal friend of his, and he had to have things explained to him in a way that he could understand, and he was then able to pass that information over to an audience. Now, Lorna would say in the original script that he wanted Vinny to be a cleverer man than the one we ultimately see in the final film. I get the impression there's a little bit of contention in just how the character turned out, that he was going to be a bagman for the mob who just pretended to be dumb. And in fact, Lorna had Vinny failing the bar exam so often down to the fact that the character, in his eyes, was dyslexic. And there isn't really any sign of that left in the final film. That was something that the ultimate director of the movie, Jonathan Lynn, moved away from. I'll come back to that shortly, because let's bring Jonathan Lynn properly into the story. Now, Jonathan Lynn, who had enormous success on television with the brilliant Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, had crossed over into movies at this stage with the film Nuns on the Run with Robbie Coltrane, Eric Idle. That had been a hit in the UK, but also crucially it had been a hit in the US, and so he was interested in 20th Century Fox in the US, and he talked he's talked about how My Cousin Vinny came to him, and he gives a really interesting DVD commentary on the disc of the film as well, and he talks about how Fox couldn't find a director for the film, that Lynn loved the script, but no one really was stepping forward to direct it, and so he says he pretty much leapt at the opportunity. And so, in terms of casting, of course, there were challenges. James Belushi actually originally turned the role of Vinny down in the film, and at that time he was also linked to a role in A League of Their Own. I don't quite know whether it was A League of Their Own that led him to turn My Cousin Vinny down, but as it turned out, he would appear in neither film. The role of Mona Lisa Vito, who was ultimately played by Marissa Tomei, well, Lorraine Bracco was in line for that. Ironic that she was appearing in Goodfellas with Joe Pesci, who would come into My Cousin Vinny, but also a meeting took place with Danny DeVito, with him having the idea, with the idea of him being someone possibly taking on the role of Vinny, at one point possibly even directing the film. The suggestion of Dale Lorna at first was Robert De Niro, and this was before De Niro had hit big with his comedy films, Analyze This, and the Meet the Parents films, which I would suggest decreased in quality quite dramatically. But the studio didn't think that De Niro really could lead a comedy, certainly not a comedy to financial success. I mean, Midnight Run happening around this point, but nonetheless, the big hit comedies that De Niro is known for hadn't happened at this point. Just an aside, Andrew Dice Clay also, he would say in his memoir that My Cousin Vinny went into development as a vehicle for him. That Andrew Dice Clay at one point was a big hope for 20th Century Fox. They cast him in The Adventures of Ford Farlane, and the assumption was that was going to be a hit and they would need to find new projects for him. The Adventures of Ford Farlane absolutely wasn't a hit, and Andrew Dice Clay, no new projects were sought for him after all, and as a consequence he didn't end up in My Cousin Vinny either. And eventually Fox put forward, I think came from the studio, the idea of Joe Pesci in the role, and it all seemed to fit, and it all slipped into place. In terms of the rest of the casting of the film, I mean, Jonathan Lynn wanted Ralph Macchio for the role of Bill Gambini, one of the pivotal roles in the film. Macchio, of course, is best known for The Karate Kid, but Lynn admits he had never seen The Karate Kid, and he'd just been taken with what work he had seen of Macchio that didn't happen to be his most successful. My Cousin Vinny is also the final film of Fred Gwynne, best known for playing Herman Munster. But here he plays Judge Chamberlain Haller, and he's great in the film. He's just really good, and it was his last film. And Lynn wanted him off the back of seeing him in the much maligned The Cotton Club. In terms of where Marissa Tomei came from, because she was an unknown really at this point. Now, Lorna had put forward her name on a list that he'd suggested to the studio. She was apparently on a long list, and he'd come across her work on stage in New York. Lynn liked her as well, and he had seen at this point she barely done any film work, but she was making Oscar with Sylvester Stallone for director John Landis, and Landis allowed Lynn into the cutting room for Oscar. It's not a very liked film at all, but Lynn saw something in Tomei that allowed him really to go and convince the studio, to convince Fox that she was the person for the film. Fox had a modest budget for this movie, and I think probably once they had Joe Pesci in place, they were happy in terms of the star power they were going to get for the price that they were paying. Lynn also brought with him, and this is on top of the work that Lorna had already done, an absolute insistence that the legalities in the film reflected real life, that they stood up. Because, I mean, in Lynn's background is a law degree and a frustration that when he was watching films that dealt with court cases, that dealt with the law, that dealt with crime and the prosecution of crime, that the movies just made stuff up, and he didn't want that. And so whilst there's some shortening of processes done and there's a degree of dramatic license, the film is regularly praised for just how accurate the depiction of the law is, to the point where in law classes it's apparently fairly regularly cited now. Lynn did do some tightening of the script. I mean, I should note, just in terms of the accuracy of the legalities, there is a story. There's a sequence in the film, an exchange about the analysis of tyres, which was apparently taken from an actual court transcript. That's the level of research that went into putting the screenplay together. So Lynn did some tightening work on the script. It was him he said in his director's commentary that the original screenplay was just too long, really, and didn't actually reveal the whodunit. It didn't resolve the crime itself. It just dealt with the court case, and so he felt it needed to have that degree of closure at the end to make the film work. So he did a production rewrite on the movie. Lorna couldn't do it because at that point he was directing a film himself, a film called Love Potion No. 9, which starred Sandra Bullock in a very early one of her very early roles. Now, I said earlier that the idea was to portray that the character of Vinny was dyslexic, and Lynn and Lorna kind of disagreed on this in the end. That Lorna had come up with quite an interesting idea of how to show blurred words and just try and visually get across the struggles that Vinny has, the character of Vinny has, in reading words, in forming them in his head. Lynn wasn't really comfortable with that. He didn't feel he could do it justice, and he turned, and thus the dyslexia angle of the character was pretty much pulled out of the film, although it still existed in little bits of publicity here and there. And I should do a shout out for a not great comedy, but in its own way quite an important one, by the name of Night School, starring Kevin Hart amongst its ensemble, with Tiffany Haddish co-starring with him. And Night School came out in 2018, and it's, I think in its own way, that's quite a groundbreaking film, in that it's the first mainstream Hollywood comedy I've seen that's visualised in a respectful way and tried to get across the difficulties some people have just in processing words. And My Cousin Vinny could have been ahead of the game there by some 25, 26 years, and I still think Hollywood's got a bit of work to do there. But I would do a shout out for an otherwise pretty forgettable film, although Tiffany Haddish is great in it, Night School, just for the work that it does. As such, the script came together, and so normally Jonathan, we're back to My Cousin Vinny here, normally Jonathan Lynn would rehearse his films quite a lot, but on this one Joe Pesci didn't want that. Pesci figured he could be funnier, he could make the character work better, he could make it all feel a bit more compelling if they basically got to set, rehearsed on the day, and then he had the spontaneity that he could have a bit more fun and spark with his performance. I do think that comes across in the final film. The budget of $10-11 million that Jonathan Lynn and the production team were working with meant that they did most things on location, which does give it quite a grounded and real feel. Even though the film is Alabama set, it was shot in the Georgia area. The one set that they did need was a courtroom set, but they basically took a warehouse in Georgia, one with a corrugated metal roof apparently, and converted that for the purposes of filming. But they hadn't really thought that far ahead, because they then were shooting these sequences in the middle of summer in Georgia in intense heat. So when you see the courtroom sequences taking place in the movie, the temperature in the room was apparently around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not a particularly comfortable room to film filming. There was a moment too where they shoot in the sequence where they shoot in a real prison. Again, this wasn't a set that was used. And one little anecdote that Lynn puts in his director's commentary is just to get the production team and the equipment into the prison each time took 40 minutes to an hour just to get through security and be able to shoot there. The film ultimately wrapped up shooting and came in on budget, and 20th Century Fox earmarked the movie for a March 1992 release date, and this allowed quite a lot of editing time actually. I mean, the film had started shooting in February 1991, it had completed filming in April 1991, so there was quite a lot of time to shape a final cut of the movie, and it did come in at 2 hours. I think if there's a fault of My Cousin Vinny, it still feels a little bit too long really, but I just think it's a really enjoyable comedy, and so I kind of go with that, to be honest. The movie though would go on to be a real surprise hit. I mean, we didn't get it in the end until summer 1992 in the UK, by which point it was known it was a hit, but it was a hit out of nowhere. It would go on to take over $150 million worldwide, at just 15 times its production budget. It would earn good reviews on the whole, particularly for the interplay between Pesci and Marissa Tomei. Both of those came in for real praise. Lynn does note in that director's DVD commentary that I mentioned that the film didn't play as well in the south of America, and he put that down to an expectation that people in the south of America were expecting it to treat them unfairly. But as he points out, My Cousin Vinny is quite a rare film of its ilk in that there's no actual villain in it, that everyone involved in law enforcement is actually just following process and following what they need to do. They've got no vested interest in taking characters down short of following the law, and he believes that he just treats it all treats the area and treats the people well, although there was clearly some wariness from audiences. Nonetheless, the film went on the film became a hit on video as well, but surprisingly too, it attracted awards attention, and more than that, it attracted an award, an Oscar in fact, and it was one that led to a bit of a Hollywood urban legend that in the Oscar ceremony in 1993, Marissa Tomei picked up the gong for Best Supporting Actress. And to give an idea of just what a long shot she was for that statue, on the way into the Oscars, I think it was Rob Reiner, who was up for Best Director for A Few Good Men that year, apparently joked that he had as much chance of winning as Marissa Tomei did, and Reiner would lose to Clint Eastwood for Unforgiven, which won the top prizes that year. But Tomei won. She defeated the likes of Vanessa Redgrave and Joe Plowright, who were up against her, but then this rumour spread that Jack Palance, who was handing out the Oscar, had read out the wrong name. But then I mean, one of the nice byproducts of the La La Land Moonlight confusion that crept up a couple of years ago is you see what happens finally when someone reads out the wrong name on the Oscar stage and someone steps in and does something about it. I think the attempt to dilute Marissa Tomei's achievement was a bit unfair really, and hopefully that's put it all to rest. Because it was such a surprise hit and one that was economical to produce, there was chatter about a possible sequel for a while. And Dale Lorna, in fact, wrote a screenplay for one. It would have taken the character of Vinny to the UK. I think it was going to be... I remember reading one news story that it was going to be called Vinny at the Old Bailey. But Marissa Tomei wasn't interested in doing it, and director Jonathan Lynn ruled himself out in the end as well. That Joe Pesci was interested for a while, but the sequel idea, even though scripts were written, did ultimately peter out. But then there is a kind of belated sequel that's finally happened in book form, that in 2017 the author Lawrence Kelter commenced a planned series of My Cousin Vinny sequel novels, and the first of those is available now. As it stands, My Cousin Vinny on screen is a one-off, although I wouldn't wager against someone picking it up for a possible television reboot or something, primarily because everything seems to be picked up for a possible television reboot at the moment. But I do think it's a really good, really fun comedy that's well worth seeking out, and it's the kind of surprise comedy hit that just didn't happen an awful lot back then. Certainly, you can't see it happening that often now. And that's been the latest episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. I've talked longer than usual, so I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. And there's a whole host of exclusive video film stories you can find on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/film stories. Thanks as always for listening and supporting the Film Stories podcast. And please help spread the word. And thank you again. You all take care. I'll be back with you again soon. Bye bye.